She is tonight a leader under intense pressure. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel acknowledged today it would be hard to bear if the man who drove a lorry into a Christmas market in Berlin turned out to be a refugee she had taken in. The killers are still on the run in the German capital tonight. The police hunt goes on. It's people uncertain what to expect next. They can only watch and wait. Also on News at 10. A widow and son on a windswept airport tarmac. The body of the Russian ambassador is flown home. The consequences of his murder far from clear. Brexit confusion from May as Nicola Sturgeon outlines her own plans. And a farewell to arms. Democrats hoping Michelle Obama would take up the fight are told today she will not stand for public office herself.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. The confusion and panic that swept through Berlin last night is far from over. The police thought they had a suspect, but not for long. The Pakistani asylum seeker they arrested last night has now been released. So the terrorist or terrorists who drove a lorry into crowds at a Christmas market is still out there somewhere. What we do know is he killed 12 people. At least 6 were German. So-called Islamic State said it was behind the attack. Our security editor, Rohit Kachru, in Berlin, has been following the investigation.
Police searched near to the scene of the slaughter tonight. They had thought that they were close to solving this. But as their early assumptions unravelled, a claim from IS that it was responsible. The 25-ton weapon that caused carnage with devastating simplicity. The decorations it toppled still caught in the windscreen. But after the lorry was removed today, the crime scene cleared, investigators had to start all over again, as from the rubble came the haze. Last night things seemed clearer, as a suspect presumed to be the driver was detained. The lorry from Poland, a refugee from Pakistan, perhaps inspired by Syria. Although prosecutors said they still assume it was an act of terrorism, there was a disclaimer.
We have to possibly get used to the thought that the person detained yesterday, who is a Pakistani national who has been preliminarily detained yesterday as a suspect, we have to get used to the thought that he may not have been the perpetrator or belong to the group of perpetrators.
Earlier, in pursuit of more details about their suspect, special forces raided a refugee centre, an airport of the Nazi era, now a symbol of the Merkel era. One refugee told me he recognised the suspect but thought nothing. But by then, Chancellor Angela Merkel had already tried to set the tone, prepared for a backlash against her policy towards refugees.
I know it would be especially hard for us all to bear if it were confirmed that the person who committed this act was someone who sought protection and asylum in Germany.
She then went to the scene of the attack, where she laid flowers at the spot where victims were killed, and where today those who survived shared their stories.
Sad. We're alive and we feel sorry for the people that aren't, but just if my daughter hadn't have stopped us, things could have been a bit different. So we consider ourselves very lucky.
Investigators cannot afford to be so reflective as they try to establish who it was who hijacked this vehicle from its Polish driver. The lorry company said its last contact was made around 3 p.m. yesterday. GPS data shows the truck's engine was started 3 separate times later in the day, as if someone was practicing how to drive before it drove off at 7:34 p.m. Then shortly after 8 p.m, the lorry was driven along Kantstrasse into the festive market beside the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. The impact is unbearable, and it's compounded by uncertainty. Some of the conclusions made about this tragedy still stand, but more than a day on, there is so much that we don't know. Rohit Katru, News at 10, Berlin.
Well, the people of Berlin clearly have a dilemma tonight, a grimly familiar one in modern Europe, it must be said. They want to defy the terrorists and make it, insofar as it can be, business as usual in the run-up to Christmas. But they know there is one or possibly more than one of them out there.
This is Berlin, but it's not Berlin as you know it. It's usually one of the most fun weeks of the year here, but the city renowned for its nightlife is tonight deserted, with at least one, if not more, dangerous people on the run. One of Europe's main cities has been paralysed by fear just days before Christmas.
It was shocking because we're visiting here. We come from Hamburg for 2 days, and half an hour before we passed, after it crashed.
You passed here just half an hour before?
Yeah, and we heard the boom, the little explosion.
Earlier, Angela Merkel joined the city's residents for a church service, just metres from last night's horror.
So what are we fighting for? What do we live for?
Outside, people in shock gathered in solidarity, sickened by the loss of life, and many shaken by what they feel is an attack on their liberal way of life.
I grew up in Berlin. I love Berlin, it's my city. I love the people here. We're like one big family, so I'm really sad about this.
Inside, a book of condolence gives residents and tourists a place to pay their respects, while the hashtag Ich bin Berliner is how people around the world are expressing their solidarity.
The service was so full this evening that people have held their own impromptu vigils in the square outside. The church, where the official vigil took place, is particularly poignant. Not only is it just yards from the scene of last night's attack, it was also partially destroyed during World War II and never fully rebuilt, to serve as a reminder of the horror of conflict.
Berliners are now seeking strength in the company of each other. The festive spirit radically dimmed tonight, but defiant. Defiance their only weapon to fight their fear. Sally Lockwood, News at 10, Berlin.
Well, let's talk to our security editor, Rohit Katru, now. He's live in Berlin. Rohit, Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, has referred to this man as a soldier, a so-called soldier of theirs. He's, clearly therefore on the run, and they've said it was them that was behind the attack. What do you read into all that?
Well, certainly the language is incredibly familiar. That reference to a soldier of the caliphate, this statement being released by the IS-affiliated Amaq news agency. This is precisely what happened following the Nice attack and other attacks too. But what's incredibly unusual here, perhaps even unique, is a claim of responsibility like this being released for a suspect who is still on the run somewhere in Western Europe. What does this tell us? Well, there is a misconception about IS claims of responsibility, that they say that they are responsible for everything. That's simply not backed up by the evidence. What is true, however, that they often imply that they directed an attack, whereas they actually only inspired it. And what is often the case is that following releases like this one tonight, in the last couple of hours, there are claims of allegiance, perhaps even on video, that are eventually released. But we will have to see what emerges in the very near future.
Well, Rohit, we're 24 hours on. Obviously, it's early days. We don't know exactly what the authorities are doing, but it seems at least possible they may have made mistakes already. What's your assessment of the investigation so far?
Well, the German authorities are notoriously cautious about what they say, about what sort of information they release in the early stages of a crime investigation. There is no doubt, though, this investigation is a mess. And the biggest fault, potentially, is that 24 hours ago, people around here should have been thinking about precisely what they saw, what they heard, perhaps sharing those tiny clues with investigators that might have helped them. But those golden hours may well have been lost by the misconceptions and perhaps even misjudgments.
OK, Rohit, for now at least, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we heard a little earlier, Angela Merkel said she would find it personally hard to take if it turns out the attacker was an asylum seeker who sought refuge in Germany. Of course, until someone is caught, there is no way of knowing, as Rohit was just saying there. But the background of the original suspect had led to demands for a crackdown on immigration and, by association, to criticism of Mrs. Merkel's open door policy. It seemed then like an act of basic humanity. She saw a terrible catastrophe unfolding. She was able to help. She chose to help. Then, as now, the exact consequences for Angela Merkel, for her countrymen, for all of us, remain unclear. It is easy to forget now the biblical scenes we witnessed in those closing months of 2015. Tens of thousands, no, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the deepening civil war in Syria. The boats arriving on the beaches of Greece like buses, and then the people on them beginning that long, arduous trek into the heart of mainland Europe. Most were heading for Germany because Angela Merkel said she would welcome them. Some argued it was a bit about economics and demographics and a need for labour. Most thought it was about basic humanity. It is, though, coming back to haunt her. This was a close political ally talking about the attack in Berlin today. We owe it to the victims, he said, to those affected and to the whole population to rethink our immigration and security policy and to change it. Angela Merkel herself seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. It would, she said, be hard to bear if the person who committed this crime turned out to be someone who sought protection and asylum in Germany. The reality is likely to be complex either way. So-called Islamic State has been working hard for years to spread terrorism throughout Europe. The refugee crisis almost certainly made it easier, but all security agencies agree the problem would exist anyway. But connecting the two is all too simple, and the German Chancellor has an election to fight soon.
It's going to be difficult for her. She has already reeled back some of her open stance on refugees over the last couple of months to make concessions to the right-wingers in her own party, because she has seen a lot of criticism over her open refugee policy over the last year. But even though the German election is still a year or so away, the refugee crises and these terrorist attacks are going to be a huge topic for her.
There is no evidence at all tonight that the man or men responsible for this were refugees. But that hasn't stopped Miss Merkel's allies from turning up the pressure. Back here, British police forces and many local councils already had security measures and physical barriers in place around Christmas markets, but those have been strengthened and improved since last night. Greater Manchester Police, for example, increased the numbers of officers on duty around 10 sites where Christmas markets are being held.
It's an attraction that draws millions every year and is known as one of the biggest and best of its kind in Europe. Manchester's Christmas market today with an increased security presence, a city which has itself suffered at the hands of terrorists, taking nothing for granted but determined to get on and enjoy itself.
We live in an age where there's individuals who want to do silly things, and I think if we stop coming out and embracing this, we're letting them win.
The fact of it all is you can't keep looking behind you all the time, can you? You can't, you know, you've got to live your life and get on with it.
Festive markets like this one in Nottingham are filled with shoppers in the days before Christmas. Protecting them without making them feel uneasy is something British authorities have long been used to. Officers visible, but not obtrusive. This concrete barrier at Birmingham's German market is designed with a specific purpose, to prevent entry to vehicles with no business there. Others nearby discreetly clad in wood to avoid putting off visitors. London has long been used to the idea that anything can be considered a target by those wanting to spread fear, and the sight of uniforms on the South Bank is nothing unusual. But other cities like Sheffield are taking precautions of their own. Police at the Christmas market, a reality of life in the 21st century, a price that has to be paid
I think it's really important that people feel reassured. Police officers will not stop a truck going at 50 miles an hour, but the hard building stuff that we've put in will. And it's important also to remember that terrorism is not just about vehicles, it's about individuals, it's about people with guns. There are many forms of terrorism and we mustn't just rely on looking at the last attack to put our defences in.
Cities like Manchester know that an attack on Berlin is an attack on them too, and vigilance is all that keeps its citizens safe.
Cities around the world are our partners. They're the people that we work with, and it's horrific to see what has happened. But also, we know that we can, as far as is possible, ensure that we don't have that happening here. We can get on with our business in this city.
Cities like this one, which have suffered themselves at the hands of terrorists, know that the best response to those who want to spread fear is to live life and to celebrate it. And that's why tonight they're celebrating Christmas, but remembering the people of Berlin, a city whose suffering won't be forgotten. Damon Green, News at 10, Manchester.
The human consequences of yesterday's assassination of Russia's ambassador to Turkey were written across the faces of his widow and son on a windswept airport in Ankara today. They were there for the grim task of accompanying his body back to Moscow. The diplomatic consequences of the shooting are rather harder to quantify, to be honest with you. Foreign ministers from both Russia and Turkey were actually meeting today, promising to guarantee any peace deal in Syria. And partly because of Syria, any diplomatic fallout is likely to be limited.
Unable to give him adequate protection in life, the powers that be here in Turkey did all they could to honour the Russian ambassador in death. In addition to the ceremonial for Andrei Karlov before his remains were flown home to Russia, the Turks also announced that the street on which the Russian embassy sits in Ankara will be named after him. Moscow's man in Turkey was shot several times in the back. The assassin shouted, "Don't forget Aleppo." The plainclothes policeman lurking behind was his killer. This morning, the Russian foreign minister sat down with his Turkish counterpart, and in the circumstances, it was all remarkably cordial. At Russian diplomatic missions across Turkey, like this, the consulate in Istanbul, security has been stepped up at the request of Vladimir Putin. But there have been no personnel pullouts announced, no angry statements issued. Logic dictates that what happened last night should have serious consequences. After all, provocations don't come much worse than the assassination of an ambassador in the capital city to which he's been posted. And yet, in the aftermath, both the Russian and Turkish leaders have been trying to calm things down. It seems neither country wants to be adversarial with the other over this. The reason is that Turkey and Russia have reached an accommodation that allows them to pursue their agendas in Syria. The Turks have decided to give the Russians a free hand to help President Assad. In return, the Russians have allowed the Turkish army to enter northern Syria to thwart the territorial ambitions of the Syrian Kurds, who are allies of the PKK, the Kurdish separatists in southern Turkey.
Russia needs Turkey to make a counterbalance against West. Because after Ukrainian and Syrian crisis, Russia is isolated from rest of the world. Politically, economically.
Russian investigators have flown to Ankara to help with the inquiry into the assassination. They want to know if the policeman who killed Andrei Karlov was a lone wolf or the recruit of a jihadist outfit that's infiltrated Turkey's security apparatus. Whatever the case, the Turkish president now owes Vladimir Putin, and that can only strengthen Russia's hand in Syria. John Irvine, News at 10, Istanbul.
By Friday, it will be 6 months since the vote to leave the European Union, and the big debate about whether Parliament will get a say or not was stirred up again today. The Prime Minister refused to guarantee that MPs will have a vote on the final deal, which was arguably odd, because less than 2 weeks ago, her Brexit Secretary David Davis said they probably would. But if Mrs May is still famously keeping her plans to herself, Scotland's First Minister was less reticent. She published her own plans, which include Scotland staying in the single market even if the rest of the UK leaves. How is that going to work? Well, Carl Dinnan has a go at explaining.
If Theresa May has proved mastery of one thing as Prime Minister, it's the ability to talk about Brexit whilst revealing almost nothing. So what she did say when she went to Parliament to be grilled by MPs today was minutely dissected. She revealed that there may have to be a transitional deal as Britain leaves the EU, and that she would make a big speech about it all in the new year. But MPs wanted to know if they'd get to vote.
It's my intention to ensure that Parliament has ample opportunity to comment on and discuss the aspects of the arrangements that we are putting in place.
Given that we know the European Parliament will have a vote on the deal, why can't you say that the British Parliament will also have a vote?
Well, what I'm saying is that there will be an opportunity for Parliament, of course, to consider, as we're going through, when more details do become available, how this is going to operate.
No mention of a vote, you'll notice, even though her own Brexit Secretary has said it's inconceivable there wouldn't be one.
A Number 10 source said they weren't ruling out a vote and would do whatever was necessary. But the lack of clarity stood in stark contrast to what went on in Edinburgh today, where the First Minister announced, of all things, a Brexit plan.
The plan Nicola Sturgeon was clutching would keep Scotland in the single market and trading with the rest of the UK.
This paper sets out how free movement of goods, services and people would continue across the UK, even with Scotland in the single market and the rest of the UK not.
She'd do that by keeping Scotland in the single market, which allows free movement of services and labour, but out of the customs union, which sets common trade tariffs. Assuming the rest of the UK also leaves the customs union, the Scottish border could then stay open. It's actually the kind of deal that Norway already has. The problem is that Theresa May would have to approve it, and she doesn't want Scotland to have its own deal.
What we will be negotiating is a United Kingdom approach and a United Kingdom relationship with the European Union. I think you've assumed an acceptance of differential relationships, which I don't think it's right to accept.
But if the Prime Minister blocks the First Minister's plans, she in turn may call for another independence referendum. It would be a major, if unintended, consequence of Brexit. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
Anyone flying off for Christmas and worried about the possible impact of a strike by baggage handlers and check-in staff can breathe a sigh of relief tonight. It is off. The strike over pay was due to take place on Friday and Saturday, Christmas Eve, at 18 separate airports. But the Unite Union, which represents workers at the Swissport ground handling firm, has agreed to keep talking about the company's pay offer, 4.65% over 3 years. Now, at an age when many people have long ago opted for a quieter life, the Queen has decided to scale back her work as a charity patron, but only by a bit. She's giving up 25 roles, which sounds quite a lot, except that she's keeping on nearly 600 others. So with the royal family Christmas lunch today at Buckingham Palace, there was perhaps some talk of which jobs the younger royals might take up from their grandmother. And for royal sports fans, there are some plum ones among them.
Members of the royal family were at Buckingham Palace today for the annual Christmas lunch there. As William, Harry and Kate arrived, along with Prince George, the Queen let it be known that they'll be taking on more responsibilities. At the end of a year in which she celebrated her 90th birthday, the Queen has relinquished her patronage of 25 organisations. A small part of the 600 patronages she holds, but nevertheless a significant reduction in her workload. It was described as a gradual shift in management rather than a big bang change.
There will inevitably be speculation that this is the start of a process in which the Queen will eventually step aside. That's given short shrift by officials here. She is, they say, absolutely still in charge.
Nearly 70 years ago, the then Princess Elizabeth made it clear she regarded being monarch as a job for life.
I declare before you all
with my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service.
In the redistribution of patronages, the younger royals will take the more sporting roles: Prince Harry Rugby League and English Rugby Union, the Duchess of Cambridge Wimbledon Tennis. For the older generation, causes closer to their hearts: Prince Charles, the Holocaust Day Memorial Trust. The Duchess of Cornwall will become the patron of Barnardo's, and the Countess of Wessex will take over the NSPCC. And the Queen will no longer be patron of the Battersea Dogs Home. A replacement will be named shortly. But today the talk was all about that most celebrated royal dog lover.
The Queen, 60 years, has really made us, I think, who we are, and we've been terribly, terribly grateful to her.
There is change in the air, gradual, but change nevertheless. Tim Hewitt, News at 10.
Towards the end of the American presidential campaign, there were those who said it should have been Michelle Obama trying to follow her husband into the Oval Office and not Hillary Clinton. And even if that was never remotely actually a practical possibility, you can see why it became a popular train of thought. Sadly for her many fans, it is clear tonight that is all it will ever be. Mrs. Obama has ruled out standing for public office. In an interview with the First Lady of American television tonight, Oprah Winfrey.
Well, welcome to my home.
Thanks for having me.
For Michelle Obama, this is the bittersweet end to her role as America's First Lady. Widely respected, she can now look forward to life without the relentless scrutiny. But she doesn't hide her deep disappointment about the election result. And referring to her husband's famous one-word campaign slogan, she talks of how hope is evaporating.
We feel the difference now. Yeah. See, now we're feeling what not having hope feels like. You know, hope is necessary. It's a necessary concept.
No, our motto is, when they go low, we go high.
Her performance on the campaign trail was at times riveting. Her advocacy for women and for decency were powerful appeals to liberal Americans shocked by the rhetoric of Donald Trump.
The shameful comments about our bodies, the disrespect of our ambitions and intellect, the belief that you can do anything you want to a woman, and the truth is, it hurts.
It immediately led some in the Democratic Party to hope that she too, like Hillary before her, would transition from First Lady to political candidate. But that is something she told Oprah Winfrey she has ruled out completely, and with it came a warning to the Trump family.
Would you ever run for office? No, I have to ask it. No. I wouldn't do that to my kids. Yeah. Because what people don't understand is that you run, their lives stop at any age. I mean, the next family that comes in here, every person in that family, every child, every grandchild, their lives will be turned upside down in a way that no American really understands.
As these London school children witnessed last year, Michelle was an effective ambassador for her husband, her country, and for girls everywhere.
And the world needs more girls like you growing up to lead our parliaments and our boardrooms and our courtrooms and our universities.
In exactly a month, Michelle, raised on the south side of Chicago, will leave the stage. And in her place will step forward Melania Trump, the former supermodel from Slovenia. It is difficult to think of two successive First Ladies with such vastly different backgrounds. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Well, to end the programme tonight, we return, of course, to Berlin, to a city remembering its dead, but determined now to stop itself being cowed by terrorism itself, one of the stories of modern Europe, you might say. The city's most recognisable landmark, the Brandenburg Gate, is tonight lit up in the colours of the German flag, in honour, of course, of the 12 dead. The scene of last night's attack, filmed from above, gives perhaps some sense of the chaos, the panic, and the fear of such a brutal and sudden attack. And just close by, a shrine of candles to remember lives lost, but also perhaps to try and keep at bay the darkness that descended on Berlin last night, as it has often in other European cities. And that is all we have time for tonight. I will be here again tomorrow night. For now, though, good night, and thank you very much indeed for watching.